disturbing and depressing is probably the best way I can put it. And so it does take students that are in that position of safety and strength to then advocate for the people who are a lot more vulnerable.
Welcome to the Personal Finance for PhDs podcast, a higher education in personal finance. This podcast is for PhDs and PhDs-to-be who want to explore the hidden curriculum of finances to learn the best practices from money management, career advancement, and advocacy for yourself and others. I'm your host, Dr. Emily Roberts, a financial educator specializing in early career PhDs and founder of Personal Finance for PhDs. This is Season 20, Episode 6, and today my guest is Garrett Dunne, a fifth-year PhD candidate in the College of Fisheries and Ocean Sciences at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Realizing that they were being dramatically underpaid, Garrett and his peers used the data from PhD Stipends to advocate for a significant stipend increase in their department. Subsequently, they joined up with grad students in other schools within the University of Alaska system to unionize and bargain for better pay and health insurance. Garrett's account of their relatively quick process includes several concrete tips for graduate students at other universities who are advocating to increase their stipends and improve their benefits, including who is in the best position to lead the charge. The tax year 2024 version of my tax return preparation workshop, How to Complete Your PhD Trainee Tax Return and Understand It Too, is now available. This pre-recorded educational workshop explains how to identify, calculate, and report your higher education-related income and expenses on your federal tax return. Whether you are a graduate student, postdoc, or postbac, domestic or international, there is a version of this workshop designed just for you. I do license these workshops to universities, but in the case that yours declines your request for sponsorship, you can purchase the appropriate version as an individual. Go to pfforphds.com/tax return workshop to read more details and purchase the workshop. You can find the show notes for this episode at pfforphds.com/S20E6. Without further ado, here's my interview with Garrett Dunne. I am delighted to have joining me on the podcast today, Garrett Dunne, who is a fifth-year PhD candidate at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and we are going to discuss increasing grad student stipends through a couple of different mechanisms, and I won't say more than that now, but hopefully you'll take away a couple of actionables that may be applicable at your own university as well. So Garrett, would you please introduce yourself a little bit further for the audience?
Hi, everybody. I am Garrett Dunne. I'm a fifth year, as you said, PhD candidate, University of Alaska Fairbanks. I study two species of shark in Alaska. I'm trying to improve the federal stock assessment for those two species. I did my undergraduate work at Eckerd College in St. Petersburg, Florida, and then I did my master's degree at Northeastern University in Boston, Massachusetts, but did my field work based out of Biloxi, Mississippi in the Gulf of Mexico. The naming has changed, but I'm going to go with Gulf of Mexico. And then I have been working on and off in Alaska for about the last decade, primarily on fishes. I started with salmonids and then transitioned into sharks, which is my true passion. But salmon's where the money is made.
Wow. Okay. You've lived all over the place. I was going to ask if you were an Alaska native or anything, but it sounds like you've been living there on and off for 10 years.
Yeah, originally I'm from New England. I split my time between New Hampshire and Massachusetts, but I really have kind of lived all over the country. And I settled in Alaska full time about 4 years ago now.
Speaking of 4 years ago, that is when we first started our email correspondence. The listeners, sometimes it takes this long to a podcast episode to get into production. So 4 years ago, you emailed me about the project that I have going on, PhD Stipends, phdstipends.com, which is a database of self-reported stipend information all across the U.S. and actually outside the U.S. as well. So let us know, what was going on with you back in 2021-ish? What was the pay you were receiving, the benefits, and what led you to reaching out about this data set?
unsurprisingly, it was because the pay and university healthcare was underwhelming. So in 2021, there was a bunch of different levels within my college. University of Alaska Fairbanks breaks up the way that they pay students one by college, and then usually within the college, it's multiple different levels. But for sake of ease here, if you averaged out what master's students were making at different levels and PhD students were making at different levels, in 2021, the average salary was about 21,500 annually for a graduate student at UAF. And to further complicate things, that really depended on what type of funding you were through. The UAF and kind of UA system is funded through a very large patchwork of different ways to be funded. I myself have been funded as a TA, RA, and fellow throughout my 5 years. And at different times and in different orders, I started as an RA, moved to fellowship, moved to TA, and now I'm an RA again. So it's a bit complicated, and the numbers change a little bit depending on what style of funding you have. Um, Sadly, after my first year of being an RA, I moved to a fellowship. And in some ways that was easier, but it did not leave enough room for summer funding. So I was unpaid in the summers. So while my take home should have been 21,500, my effective take home because of the lack of pay in the summers was about 17,000, which is quite low. And the cost of living in Alaska is very high. The federal government adjusts, I think, their numbers from, I think, 1.25 or 1.5 times the poverty line for Alaska. And in 2021, the poverty line was $16,000 a year in Alaska. So as a graduate student in the sciences, I was being paid $1,000 above the poverty line, and I was forced to take additional work on in the summers. I didn't mind taking on that work. It was something that I got to, I've always enjoyed and actually did before going back to graduate school, but it has significantly delayed my progress on my dissertation. And so, yeah, we kind of came to the realization as a college that we just were not being paid enough, and too many people were living at near poverty levels, and we wanted to push the graduate school to do better. And most of this work was led by the student organization within my college, so the Fisheries student organization, where people realized that the healthcare was poor, and that we were being underpaid. And because of this patchwork nature, people were going from making $21,000 a year to me, then making 17 a year, and then I wasn't even sure if I was going to get paid the following year. So quite complex as far as things go.
Also shockingly low numbers for 2021, as you said, in a relatively high cost of living area. Wow. I mean, I know you just sort of offered part of the effect on your own personal finances, which is that you had to take outside work in the summer, which has then, therefore you're not working towards your dissertation, and that's going to push things out. Would you be willing to share with us anything else that you experienced on that low stipend at that time, or maybe that you observed your peers experiencing?
Yeah, for me personally, it was just I had no ability to save. And so I was living very much paycheck to paycheck. I was in the privileged position of coming into my PhD with no major debt. So I didn't have major debt from undergrad or large car loans or a home loan, anything like that. And I was living paycheck to paycheck. And so for others that I had spoke to, people coming in with undergraduate debt or master's debt or medical debt, which is a huge problem in the United States, they were actively losing money. And so they were dipping into their own savings to be able to have the privilege of going to the graduate school. And it was becoming a real problem. And once we started digging into it, one of the reasons that we were paid so low was that we realized that the college had not given a pay raise to graduate students since 2008. So we were in 2021 and we had not gotten a pay raise since 2008. And so in 2008, the pay was actually fairly competitive and did keep up at least somewhat with the cost of living in the area. But I used the data set that you provided to then look at how we were being paid nationally, and even in compared to low cost of living areas. At 21.5, we were being underpaid, and then you had students like me who were making just above the poverty line, and we were obviously being deeply underpaid. And so we took this data set. I did most of the data analysis and just kind of made box plots and just looked at the fact that we were being underpaid nationally, and within specifically our disciplines. I used your data set, got rid of everything that didn't have to do with kind of biological science, and we were still being underpaid nationally. And again, we live in a relatively high cost of living area. Yeah, it is not one of the major coastal cities, but Alaska is expensive, and especially the stuff that graduate students need. Food is very expensive. Housing used to be inexpensive. That has changed actually just really in the last 5 years, especially in the major campus areas, which would be Anchorage, Fairbanks, and Juneau. I don't live in any of those, partially because of the high cost of living. But with food and shelter being expensive, it really, really dips into our ability to survive up here, and not have to dip into savings or take out loans, which many other students did.
Yeah, so the data from PhD stipends. Okay, first of all, I was in graduate school in 2008 and those numbers are still not that rosy. Especially I was even in a moderate cost of living area and I was being paid more than that. Yes. Okay. So your lived experience is we're barely above the poverty line. People are having to, do outside work and these kinds of things to get along here. That's your lived experience. Then also you look at this data set and you're like, wow, wow, wow. Okay. Everybody else across the board is getting paid more than us. What was and you did this data analysis. And then what was the next step that you took, like with approaching the administration, for example?
The last part of that analysis was looking and saying, okay, so we are being underpaid, and then actually adjusting using the federal numbers to adjust what we were being paid to the current marketplace. So taking in the inflation and the fact that the federal government says that our poverty level is higher. And so our average was 21,005. Adjusting for all of that, it was about 30,000 is what we should have been paid in 2021 compared to what it was in 2008, which I think is definitely more competitive. Still not that competitive, but more competitive. And so our next steps after having those numbers, having this write up and all of this data analysis was mostly getting, at first, graduate students riled up. I mean, all of this came out of the fact that we kept having these student meetings and all these graduate students were saying, I can't pay for the health care. I'm having to choose, I'm having to ration meals. I'm having to live in one of the unique experiences the University of Alaska Fairbanks is dry cabin living, and it is not something that a lot of people think about. Fairbanks gets incredibly cold. Last winter, we hit -50 Fahrenheit. So aggressively cold. So heating buildings is not always feasible. And so a lot of the cabins do not have running water. And so a lot of graduate students have had to resort to living in dry cabins that are heated in a variety of ways with no running water.
That's a new one for me. Wow.
Yes. Yeah, and so that had used to be the way that you could save money and attend the university is an experience, and not everyone dislikes it, but it is a difficult one. And those dry cabins have actually gotten quite expensive. And so, even when I joined the university in 2020, those were usually $400, $500 a month, and you could get a small cabin for yourself. Those prices have skyrocketed close to $1,000 a month for the privilege to live without running water. And so during COVID, the university shut down shower access. We have lots of students living in dry cabins. So that got everyone quite angry. And then we all got together, decided that the pay was too low, the healthcare sucked, got us all angry. And then we approached our faculty. And not all faculty were supportive, but my advisor was quite supportive, and a couple of new faculty especially were supportive of this because similar to your experience, which was they looked around, they went, oh wow, we're not paying these students enough. And they had seen other university systems and seen the conditions for other graduate students and were very supportive of bringing that forward. And so we got a large portion of the graduate students, a number of the faculty, and then we approached the dean. And that is how we pushed forward with it and said, you are criminally underpaying us. Some people are living at or below the poverty line. Something needs to be done. And we did effectively petition for a pay increase. It wasn't everything we wanted, but it was at least a sizable increase.
How long did that take from the point of, I guess, first approaching the dean to the pay increase? What was that timeline?
The timeline for approval was surprisingly short. I think that was about a month, 2 months of negotiation. We did have to wait to the next fiscal year for it to be implemented, however. So that took a bit longer. I think the problem was we had told the dean, problem for him was that we had told him that we were going to start going to the papers. The fact that we had students living in poverty and squalor um, was a real problem and it was going to look really bad for the dean and the university. We were also significantly underpaid compared to the other science disciplines within the university program. The other colleges in other sciences, especially geoscience, aerospace, those kind of programs are quite well funded. And as I said, we hadn't gotten a pay raise since 2008. So it was a bit of an issue.
So you used PhD stipends, but you also were gathering data from your peers at your university.
Yeah, absolutely. And just saying that we're even being underpaid within the university system. So PhD stipends was absolutely one of the best ways we could say, look, not only are you underpaying us compared to these other colleges, but like you are underpaying us nationally, and it's expensive to be here. So yeah, it was kind of a double whammy.
One of the, I guess, points of criticism about PhD stipends that I've heard from other advocates is, at least what they heard when they presented the data, was this is self-reported. This has not been verified by anybody. Did you get any pushback like that? Or was it just so obvious in your case that we overlook that?
I had to do a lot of cleaning of the data set to make sure that we were getting out outlier values because there are definitely some things that have been mistyped. And, you had to take out some of the small values and some of the extreme values where you've got somebody who's counting their stipend as like they're being paid by a tech company to go back to school and they're reporting that they're getting $80,000 or $90,000 a year to go back to graduate school. We had to pull all of that out, but we really didn't get much pushback on it because it was just so obvious that we were being underpaid, even if some people were misreporting and there were some outlier values still contained within it. Yeah, we didn't get much pushback. And the fact that they hadn't given us pay raise since 2008 pretty much just, it was self-explanatory that we something needed to be done.
Absolutely. Emily here for a brief interlude. Tax season is in full swing, and the best place to go for information tailored to you as a graduate student, postdoc, or postbac is pfforphds.com/tax. From that page, I have linked to all of my free tax resources, many of which I have updated for this tax year. On that page, you will find podcast episodes, videos, and articles on all kinds of tax topics relevant to PhDs and PhDs to be. There are also opportunities to join the Personal Finance for PhDs mailing list to receive PDF summaries and spreadsheets that you can work with. Again, you can find all of these free resources linked from pfforphds.com/tax. Now back to the interview. And so the next step was you achieved this big win for your department, but then you rolled this into a larger movement. Can you tell us about that larger unionization movement?
Yeah, yeah, and I don't want to undersell this. So we were kind of having this conversation within our own college and pushed for the pay raise, and we actually got them to agree to a biennial pay increase as well, pegged to inflation, which was really nice for us. So we didn't have to fight for it as often. And as a part of this, we started kind of hearing murmurs in the background that actually the some of the liberal arts colleges had already started talking about unionization. So I don't want to say that we were the start of this, but we did join in with a lot of gusto. And so we heard that there were other organization groups. And so one of the main reasons that that started in the liberal arts college is, to my understanding, they were being paid at or below poverty line at their maximum amount of pay. So most of these students were making between like $14,000 and $17,000 a year, and that was maximum. If their summers weren't paid for, they were making $12,000 a year, well below the poverty line for Alaska. And so they had a lot more reason to be even angrier. So they kind of got things started, and then we joined in that process. And so that the murmurings of that happened, I think, around the time I got started in 2020, and then by 2020, late 2021, early 2022 is when things kind of got moving. And I'm happy to talk more about kind of that process if that's something you want to dive into.
Yeah, maybe give us because we don't need to motivate this. We obviously see the problem with the pay for the graduate students. I'm more curious about, at the time of either, voting to form a union or starting to approach the administration about the contract? Like, just go over how that process went for you all. We've heard it a couple of times on the podcast before, but every story is a bit unique. So I'd love to hear yours.
Yeah, yeah. The healthcare seems to be one of the biggest drivers for us. The pay was always bad for most of the graduate students, and that was always an easy one. But we are under United Healthcare Student Resources, and United has a reputation, deservedly so, for being quite poor and frequent to deny pretty much any type of coverage. It's actually how I got involved in all of this. Was I spent about 2 years fighting with them, and so we kind of took these people who were upset about pay and very much upset about healthcare. And we were getting a lot of pushback from United and the student healthcare manager at the university. And so we decided to say that we were not getting anywhere as a group. And so we started talking internally and seeing what it would take to form a union. And so it was starting to take, like, the student organization out of the College of Fisheries and Ocean Sciences, which is the college I'm in, and finally meeting with the a lot of the liberal arts colleges. Many colleges have this problem, or universities have this problem, where the different colleges are quite separate. Alaska is specifically difficult because we are so spread out. It is a giant state. The UA system, since it is integrated, we actually had to unionize across all of the colleges. We could not just unionize UAF or UAA. And so it was trying to get all the graduate students from all the different colleges together in enough of a critical mass to then move forward. So that was step one, was just trying to get these meetings and get enough, frankly, upset students together to say, okay, so this is something that we actually do want to do. The next step from there was then saying, okay, we need to start picking people who have time and ability to then become officers and really lead the charge. I was one of the officers during that push, but I was definitely not one of the leaders. I was just kind of there to help do paperwork, reach out to people, move forward, and get in contact with people. And once we kind of had officers, the major next step was getting the word out and finding union representation. And that was, honestly, that's one of the biggest key steps that in retrospect I see, is just, you can't do it alone. You need lawyers, and you need someone who's actually been through the unionization process before, because all of us officers were very engaged, very motivated, but we needed somebody to actually guide us through. And so we approached two unions, one of which we never had much interest from, and then UAW, so United Auto Workers, which I did not think would be heavily involved with graduate students in the United States, which they are, was really excited about working with us. And kind of, we got in touch with them, found somebody who's going to be, our union rep for this process, and their set of lawyers, and that's really where we got the ball rolling.
Wow. Okay. So the ball's rolling on the unionization process. I think the next step is like a card drive, like a signature drive kind of thing. And
Yep.
then it's starting to talk with the admin, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And so card drive was next. And that was, again, trying to make sure we had that critical mass of pissed off students before we kind of even got that ball rolling. And that was really difficult, especially up here, because I'm more in the Anchorage area. And so I had cards shipped down to me. UAF primarily, they have the bulk of the graduate students for the UA system. And so we were the primary university for driving this. We were shipping most of the cards everywhere. But it was really trying to make sure that we had representation of these officers in all these different places, so we could go to offices, hand out cards, talk to people. Because graduate students are bombed with emails. The best thing you can do is call people in this day and age, text people. Emails sometimes work, but we didn't always have the best response there. And it was really the officers in the background making sure we went through every graduate student, collecting everyone we could, and just reaching out over and over again to get those cards signed. It was an incredibly successful drive. The graduate students in the UA system are quite upset with kind of the general state of things. And that's not always the university's fault. There's more information there we can always chat about. There were some very large cuts in 2019 to the university system that have made it very hard to make things better for everyone, including faculty and staff. But we got the cards together, and then yeah, I mean, we had representation, and then we could approach the university, and then we went directly into bargaining. And we bargained for a contract, if I'm not misremembering, within 5 months, which is unheard of. Getting from card drive to a formal union in a contract within a year is impressive. So we went quickly into bargaining and then had a contract within a year. And we have signed and it is formed.
Yeah, I'm also surprised by that speed, especially given what you just said about there being university wide like funding cuts just prior. So like what do you think what were the factors that made that happen and especially fast for you all?
I mean, we were protesting a ton. We were protesting on the University of Alaska Anchorage campus, UAS, and UAF. UAF, especially because we have the largest population of graduate students. We were regularly picketing the deans of the colleges and the deans of the college and the university. I mean, we were just being very loud and obnoxious. And we were talking to several papers up here, really just getting the word out that we were very, very unhappy. And that was the best thing that we could have done. Partially because the university is so resource strapped as well. We got more than what we initially asked for as far as inclusion within the graduate school. So it's a difficult thing to deal with, but the TAs and RAs are very easy to say, yeah, they're employees of the graduate school. The fellows, as I talked about, it's a much more washy area, but we actually managed to get all the fellows included as well as some staff. There were a lot of weird kind of one-off students that are partially employed by the university, also in graduate school, and we got a lot of those included as well. The university did not play their hand particularly well, and the state was very sympathetic to a lot of our arguments. So it went quite well for us there. Yeah, and the speed was just because the university was tired of dealing with us. We really wore them out. We did not get everything that we wanted within the contract. One of the big things that we had to jettison for the year was the healthcare. And so that's what I care about most, but we had already signed a contract with United for that year. And so if we wanted a contract that at least locked in a floor for all graduate students for pay and a lot of other, representation, grievance policies, things that really are a huge part of what a union provides and streamlining all of that, we had to wait for this year, which we are now going into bargaining for.
So all parties knew that that was still going to be renegotiated as soon as possible.
Yeah, we wanted to, and absolutely, it's why I got involved, and I was disappointed to see that that was the case, but the university just didn't have time. They had already signed the contract with United. So yeah, all parties knew that we were going to be coming back to the bargaining table within the next year or two to work on that. One of the fun things that we discovered through this whole process of discovery and requesting information from the university was for years we had been told that, actually, no, we look at this every year. We find the best healthcare for you guys, and we're really on it. And through discovery, we found out that literally they just check the mark. They ask for requests from 3 possible institutions. They pick the cheapest one and go with it. And turns out they're pretty much just rubber stamping United every year because United shifts most of the cost to the graduate students, so they can provide the lowest cost to the university on the healthcare. For the record, we are also required to buy this healthcare. There is no way to opt out, and it's become quite expensive. It's about $1,500 a semester now, and it was about $1,000 a semester previously, and that's before co-pays and all of that. Yeah, it's poor coverage.
Okay, so forthcoming progress on the healthcare front, but in terms of the stipend, can you tell us like what's the new minimum or like maybe what you're making now versus what you were making before?
Yeah. My experience is probably not the best one to go for because I've now switched back to an RA ship, and so I've gone back up to being paid quite a bit better and through the summers. So I'm no longer living at that kind of 17,000 and having to take on summer work. My new pay rate is closer to 25,000 a year, which is more reasonable. It's not amazing, but it's definitely more reasonable. If you average out all of the different pay steps that they still have within our college, because while we put a floor through the union for the whole university system, our pay actually wasn't affected all of that much. We just now get a regular annual increase pegged to inflation rather than we didn't see a pay raise because we were already above that floor. The average now is about 27,000 a year. And some graduate students are now making over 30,000, which if you remember from when we were chatting earlier is in 2021, arguably kind of where we should have been if we had actually kept giving pay raises with inflation. That said, inflation's been rampant over the last 4 years or so, post-COVID, or whatever we want to call this era of time. And so I would argue that we're now should probably be paid in kind of the mid 30,000s if we were really trying to be competitive. But it is significantly better than it was, although the healthcare is not where we would like it to be.
Okay. So on your personal side, the work that you did with your peers to, advocate for increasing the stipends within your department, that was sufficient to bring everybody above the minimum that then was set by the union. So really it's like both efforts were important. Like that unionization part of it is not going to allow you guys to drop below any floors. It's going to make sure that everything is reevaluated on an annual or biannual basis. But you had already done a great amount of legwork for your closer group of peers. But now we get to extend this to a much wider group within the university.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was the case is the College of Fisheries and a lot of the science colleges didn't see much of a pay raise. We did get those locked in, annual or biannual increases. But it was really trying to keep, especially our liberal arts colleagues from living in poverty.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was one of the privileges of being able to be a part of this was I was able to work before I went back to graduate school. I had savings and I was less concerned with retaliation from the
Mm-hmm.
university. And it was something that I felt good that I was able to provide was help push through to help our lower paid colleagues who really just didn't have a lot of leeway and ability to then argue without worrying about retaliation from the
Mm-hmm.
university. And there were several times where retaliation seemed to be very much on the table. The power dynamics of going through a unionization push was not what I expected it to be. And it was difficult for sure.
Can you share any more about that observation?
The power dynamics of some of these people who are leading colleges and being paid hundreds of thousands of dollars against students who are living at or below the poverty line, taking out loans to survive, and are deeply concerned that if they get sick or are living with chronic illness, they're going to fall into deep medical debt. Is It's disturbing and depressing is probably the worst, the best way I can put it. And so it takes often students that are in positions that are a little bit more stable
Mm-hmm.
and have support. Like I said, my advisor was very supportive of both our push for a pay raise within the college and the unionization push, that I felt safe.
Mm-hmm.
And so it does take students that are in that position of safety and strength to then advocate for the people who are a lot more vulnerable, because they simply, the power dynamics don't allow for them to be as loud.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. I hope that for any listeners who are interested in this, who there's not yet union representation for their campuses, that they'll take an eye to themselves and see, am I in this more privileged position? Am I in a safer position to be able to advocate on behalf of my peers? Or am I not? And I need to advocate within my peer group for somebody else to take on these bigger roles. But I'm really glad to hear that you felt like you were able to do that and carried through with all this wonderful progress. Would you say, so earlier, you mentioned that like the main thing for you having the lower stipend was that you weren't able to save anything. Are you able to save now?
I am, yeah, which is quite nice. And primarily I'm saving up for unexpected car repairs, and it is not a significant amount of savings, but it is much more stable. And I don't have to worry about going to the grocery store anymore, which is very nice. And not having to shop all of the worst possible, least expensive brands is also a bit of a relief. And so, I mean, one of the ways I was able to survive at that very low pay rate was, and I think this ties into a question we'll probably talk about more, is by creating a very, very detailed budget. I mean, I have a monthly spreadsheet that has all incomes, all outflows, and then an annual up or down. And that's how I kept track of the fact that I was actually generally losing money at that lower stipend level, was that you could see, month to month, I was losing a couple $100. I was in the lucky place to have some savings, so I was able to dip into that rather than taking out loans or asking money from friends and family. But that is not the position for many graduate students that I spoke to pre-unionization push. So
Yeah. And do we really want to select for graduate students who have worked prior to graduate school, who have family support, et cetera, et cetera? Or do we want graduate school to be a place that anybody can financially survive?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Great. Well, Garrett, this has been such a wonderful story. I'm so glad that you came on to share it with us. I would love to hear from you the answer to the question I ask of all my guests at the end of interviews, which is, what is your best financial advice for another early career PhD? And it can be something that we've touched on already, or it could be something completely new.
Yeah, I think I'm going to echo a lot of the themes we've had during this interview. First is to pay attention to the entire compensation package. It's not just the stipend, but also, especially for us, in my experience, the healthcare that's provided, how expensive that's going to be, what your expected out of pocket is going to be. Does university provide it? Do you pay it through your grants? And then you need to really understand the cost of living in the area that you'll be doing your work from. If you're lucky enough, like me, to be able to do things remotely, you can reduce some of your costs, but a lot of universities I know don't allow for that. And so you need to see what your pay is going to be, what your healthcare is going to be, and any other kind of sneaky costs and costs of living are going to be. For me, it was a benefit to wait to return to grad school, make sure that I had some savings and was able to have resources available in case of an unexpected car repair or a surprise cost, a surprise injury. And so I would encourage some graduate students to consider whether going directly to graduate school is the best option for them, depending on financial situation. My budget spreadsheet or using an application for keeping track of your finances, I think, is huge. It really, really helped me when I was living at kind of the most spare ends of when I was being paid. And then one of the biggest issues for me, and we haven't really touched on this, but also looking at how long that funding that you have for your graduate program lasts. I came into graduate school with only 1 year of funding. And so every year I've had to reapply, and it's been a huge stressor for me and a big financial strain, not knowing whether I'm going to be in graduate school next year. I do not know if I'm going to get paid. I don't know if I'm going to have my classes taken care of. I've been really lucky. I've managed to get all the way through, and every year I've managed to find some form of funding, but it's been really tight and very close in a couple ways. And so I think that is one of the things that's most important, is making sure that there's enough money for at least your first many years and that it's stable. We live in a climate now where funding stability is much more in question, and it's definitely worth asking that before you decide to go to any program.
Absolutely. For like prospective graduate students, looking at the offer letters and starting to do visits or interviews or what have you, what's the best way, do you think, for them to find out some tricky things like that? What is this insurance policy actually going to cost me out of pocket? That kind of information within this compressed time period of like the admission season.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is the real hard part, is you're juggling multiple universities, multiple offers, and trying to figure out how to navigate it all. Graduate student groups are probably one of the best ways I've found, because often that's where a lot of the grievances are held. And that's where I got together with my colleagues and kind of figured out how to start pushing forward towards action. So any of the graduate student groups and the colleges that you might be going to, great people to reach out to. Other graduate students within your lab, often I would argue the ones that are farther along tend to understand the systems a little bit more and be a little bit more honest about the difficulties that they've had within the system. And those are probably my two biggest resources. They tend to be the most honest about both the benefits and drawbacks of those institutions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they've had time to see maybe some edge cases play out, like, oh yeah, this is normally how things go, but like 10% of the time it goes this other way, Well, Garrett, again, thank you so much for agreeing to come on to the podcast and talk about this whole process. It's been a long, time in making this story, but I'm really, really glad to hear this, not a final outcome, but this point in the process and how things have been for you and your peers. So thank you so much for your work and for sharing it with my audience.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. And thank you so much for having me. I'm just hoping we can make the graduate student experience better for everyone.
Listeners, thank you for joining me for this episode. I have a gift for you. You know that final question I ask of all my guests regarding their best financial advice? My team has collected short summaries of all the answers ever given on the podcast into a document that is updated with each new episode release. You can gain access to it by registering for my mailing list at pfforphds.com/advice. Would you like to access transcripts or videos of each episode? I link the show notes for each episode from pfforphds.com/podcast. See you in the next episode, and remember, you don't have to have a PhD to succeed with personal finance, but it helps. Nothing you hear on this podcast should be taken as financial, tax, or legal advice for any individual. The music is Stages of Awakening by Poddington Bear from the Free Music Archive and is shared under CC by NC. Podcast editing by me and show notes creation by Dr. Jill Hoffman.